I'm Todd Thompson, and I'm happy to be here. Let me just make sure I can. That's Kat, who was my research assistant when I started this project. So a lot of credit for this goes to Kat, especially if you don't like it. And I will say on the outset, I'm worried about this going down because I'm full of fruit and coffee, and I don't want you to hear my stomach. Okay, to start. In January 1873, Sam Clemens wrote a pair of letters as Mark Twain for the New York Tribune in response to public interest in the Sandwich Islands, as most Americans then called Hawaii. As Jim here has noted, these Tribune letters were both, quote, clearly amalgamations of the comic lecture Our Fellow Savages and material from the Sandwich Islands portions of the recently published Roughing It, Why We're Here. And we can talk later about how that makes it difficult to do some of the things that I'm going to talk about doing here. In the January 6th letter, Twain briefly recalls his time 6 years prior in the, quote, blessed retreat of Hawaii, describes the variances of climate at different altitudes on different islands, gives his largely positive impressions of the native Hawaiians, while noting their steep population declines, recounts their mass conversions to Christianity, gives info on the 3,000 or so whites on the island, and offers details on the sugar industry there, and ends by making a case for William Lunalilo, aka Prince Bill, as the next king. The second letter is published 3 days later, on January 9th. That's longer, and it delves into explanations of Hawaiian government, the monarchy, the legislature, the ministers. Twain also gives more details on Prince Bill, depicts a funeral he attended in Hawaii, speaks of the late King Kamehameha V's Anglicanism, and perhaps most importantly, ends with a section called Why We Should Annex, which lays out a bitterly ironic case for U.S. annexation of Hawaii. The January 6th Tribune featured two other pieces about Hawaii along with Twain's first letter. One, printed immediately above Views of Mark Twain, a characteristic letter from the humorist, was titled The Sandwich Islands, Schemes of Annexation, a proposition from England to counterbalance American influence in the Sandwich Islands. The cause of this annexation fever was the recent death of Kamehameha V on December 11th, 1872. His obituary had just appeared in the January 2nd Tribune. Kamehameha died without naming an heir, which led to some confusion over who would be the next king, and thus sparking some renewed chatter among U.S. citizens and politicians alike about annexing the islands. Of course, that wouldn't happen until 1898, but there's periods of discussion of it throughout the mid to late 19th century. Another piece on the editorial page of the same issue, January 6th of the Tribune, makes a case for Twain as an expert on Hawaii, praising him as a, quote, shrewd and accurate observer, and his letter as, quote, not merely food for laughter, but subjects for reflection. Now, several periodicals in reprinting or excerpting Twain's January 6th Tribune letter buttressed his credentials as a serious expert on Hawaii by repeating this line, so creating a sort of an echo chamber, amplifying and justifying Twain's authority on the subject. Others praised Twain's expertise as much as his humor in their own introductions of reprinted extracts. For instance, the Moore County Transcript and Tennessee Herald write that, quote, the articles give much valuable information spiced with the inimitable humor of the author. Even a Honolulu paper, the Pacific Commercial Advertiser, praised the, quote, vast deal of sound sense conveyed in the satire of the following extracts from a recent letter by Mark Twain. But editors and readers may have put a bit too much faith in Twain's credibility on, and especially his influence over Hawaiian affairs. This is clearest in responses to news that Lunalilo had taken over the Hawaiian throne. Twain had ended his January 6th letter with a plea for Lunalilo to be considered for king. What Twain could not have known was that Lunalilo had already been chosen by popular vote on January 1st, elected by the Legislative Assembly on January 8th, sworn in on January 9th, which is the same day that his second letter appeared. That news, of course, didn't reach the U.S. until the end of the month, but that didn't stop newspaper editors from imagining that Twain's advocacy in the Tribune letters had something to do with this appointment. So it's the logical fallacy of false cause. Several papers relied on Twain's Tribune descriptions of Lunalilo to inform their readers about a new king. Others exaggerated Twain's influence, situating him as a kingmaker. My favorite example of this is the Chicago Tribune, which referred to, quote, Mark Twain's title to the Warwick of the Sandwich Islands. This is a reference to Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, was an English nobleman from the 15th century known as Warwick the Kingmaker. Even more cavalier was a Deer Lodge, Montana paper called the New Northwest, which played fast and loose with recent events. The old king died a year or two ago, you know, and Mark Twain succeeded in getting an old friend of his, Bill Lunalilo, who took care of Mark's wardrobe when he was over there, writing up fashion articles, elected king. Everything went swimmingly for a while, and Mark Twain wrote up his friend in the New York Tribune until he was almost as famous as the king of the Cannibal Islands. Though the tone of this piece is obviously tongue-in-cheek, the fact that a Montana paper is referencing Twain's Tribune letters 9 months after the fact shows both their broad reach and the authority they were perceived to wield, even if it's partly jokingly. This reach was largely due to the circulation of reprinted excerpts. So the parts of Twain's letters that editors saw fit to excerpt in their own papers and magazines reveals much about their and their readership's relationships to Hawaii, to the U.S.'s annexation ambitions, and also to Twain. So I performed keyword searches in 4 different periodical databases. And in doing so, I found 68 separate reprints of or overt references to Twain's 1873 letters, and I only looked in 1873. Of course, there were likely many more than this. What I could find is based entirely on which newspapers have been digitized for the databases that I have access to. And there's another thing we could talk about, which is the invisible level of access that we have at different institutions. Right? My institution, being woefully underfunded, has a different level of access to the same databases that other places have, but that's not noted. It also depends on the accuracy of OCR, optical character recognition, the technologies that allow for keyword searching in the first place, and of course, human error, the choices that I make in picking the keywords to search. Anyway, some distant reading. Of these 68 reprints, 64 are from January, February, or March of 1873. 59 of them are from January or February, which demonstrates their immediate, if not particularly lasting, popularity. So once I collected all these reprints, I charted them, noted how they introduced Twain's material, and then coded their contents. Whether Twain or Tribune editor Whitelaw Reid intended it or not, the fact that both of Twain's Tribune letters are divided into separate sections with subheads made it easier for editors with scissors to excerpt a discrete part of the letter. So of the 68 reprints, I counted 18 as reprinting either an entire letter or a broad variety of excerpts. And then there's a bunch of single excerpts. The most common single section reprinted was Twain's description from the first letter on Hawaii's climate. More on that in a second. I found 13 of those. Tied for second most popular at 8 was the end of Twain's second letter, the title of my talk, in which he ironically discusses annexation. I also counted 8 reprints of a section from the second letter giving a satirical character sketch of Charles Harris, an American minister in the Hawaiian government and a favorite target of Twain. There's also 4 reprints of Twain's account of Prince Bill, all after news that he'd been named king. 3 reprints describing Hawaii's bloated governmental structure. 2 reprints detailing Kamehameha V's life and habits. 2 identical reprints giving Twain's serious account of possibilities for the sugar industry. 2 just reprinting a joke on whiskey in Awa, and 1 about Twain's quip about Americanizing the islands by sending lectures and then volunteering himself as tribute. I also counted 9 what I'm calling references to the letters, which is where they're mentioned but not directly quoting from there. So in the essay that I hope to expand this talk into, I will do some contextual close readings of the most oft reprinted excerpts. Today I'm just going to leap quickly to some conclusions about why editors chose to reprint the selections they did, why that matters, and then just sit back and let you fill in the blanks and with your impressions and insights from your experience. So first, as I mentioned, the most common reprint is Twain's description from the beginning of the first letter on the delicious variations in Hawaiian climate. Here's a couple examples. Some quote several paragraphs, including Twain's descriptions of the natives, but most concentrate on the weather. Removed from the context of the rest of Twain's commentary in his Tribune letters, these excerpts engage in one of the major tropes of what Paul Lyons, he rest in peace, describes as, quote, American Pacificism, idyllic depictions of Hawaii and other Pacific islands that rely on dangerous, quote, double logic that the islands are imagined at once as places to be civilized and as escapes from civilization. So in this way, the overt politics of annexation that are kind of elided in reprints like this, as they excerpt only the bits on climate, tend to implicitly objectify Hawaii as a paradisical escape that should therefore be conquered or annexed. The majority of reprints excerpting Twain's description of Hawaii's weather appear under the same title. That title is Climate to Order. Importantly, this was not one of the subheads in Twain's letter as it appeared in the Tribune. So what this probably means is that editors are reprinting other editors' reprints of this piece. This is how virality works, instead of working directly from the Tribune article. And because it was less overtly political, it was less timely, which means it was newsworthy for a little bit longer. So 2 of the 5 excerpts that I found after February 1873 are on climate. So if Climate to Order is the most reprinted piece, and maybe Twain at his least political overtly anyway, the second most reprinted portion, Why We Should Annex, quotes the end of the second letter to invoke Twain at his most political. But it seems that editors excerpting these passages either didn't get the joke or willfully misread it, and this could be controversial here. There's a whole generation of Twain scholars that read this straight. Oh, I touched the nerve. What these editors choose to reprint as evidence of Twain's, we'll get there, views on annexation, and the way they choose to introduce it, saps Twain's critique, I think, of its angry power. For instance, the National Union and American, Daily Phoenix, and Anderson Intelligencer all introduced this blurb identically. Quote, Mark Twain is in favor of annexing the Sandwich Islands, he says, ... excerpt. Even papers that reprinted the entire section, which has some critiques of U.S. Government. Sorry, I lost my place. They tend to situate it as pro-annexation as well. The Portland Daily Press introduces a reprinting of the entire section as follows, quote, Mark Twain is writing the Tribune some characteristic letters respecting the government in connection with the mooted annexation. He gives the following reasons, quote, why we should annex, all caps. In each case, the framing of excerpts makes it seem as though Twain's pro-annexation stance is serious. It is possible that these editors are merely echoing Twain's irony, assuming that the presence of the name Mark Twain in the title would signal to readers that they should suspect the excerpt's sincerity. But for me, the pains to which Twain, the Tribune, and many reprinting papers want to establish his credibility as an expert on the subject of Hawaii would maybe tend to argue against that. The final excerpt that I'll just briefly mention today, also reprinted 8 times in 1873, often appeared under the title A Royal Minister. And this one's a little complicated to talk about. In his telltale description of the blackguard Harris, again a favorite target, Twain uses some comparative exaggeration to make a Hawaiian government official into a classic comic Yankee. It's likely that this excerpt's kind of characteristic Twain humor is why editors chose to reprint it. But given the seeming reluctance to reprint Twain's takedowns of corruption in the U.S. government, the parts of the Why We Should Annex that they didn't reprint, Harris might have been kind of a safer subject for readers to see as a scapegoat, right? A greedy, ugly American to mock. But like the climate and annexation excerpts, the popularity of this reprint might tell us more about editors' predilections than it does about Twain's writing about Hawaii per se. In fact, all these reprints underscore the lack of editorial control that Twain had over his own image and his messaging on Hawaii, since editors could pick and choose what to reprint from his lectures as well as his letters, right? We could do the same thing, and I have, with his lectures. And though more reprints of a particular excerpt doesn't automatically mean that it had more eyeballs on it, counting and analyzing which parts of Twain's Hawaii letters were most widely reprinted does allow us to make some educated guesses about what and how typical American newspaper readers and some magazine readers learned about Hawaii and about Mark Twain, especially in 1873. So really all I've tried to do here in these few minutes is to offer kind of a glimpse of the methodology for reading Twain as many 19th century readers did, not his whole works, but excerpts in newspapers, and to situate him within the 19th century culture of reprint. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.